You guys weren't gonna press that.
No, you're like the reason, like, it's not anyone's fault because I always make sure that it's been hit, like, and that was my failure as well. It's not.
Let me just absolve myself. I've never been the recorder, never will be the recorder.
I mean,
Yeah. So
in a certain way, it's my fault because I am the one who always presses it, but I didn't press it.
In a certain way, it's nobody's fault and everyone's fault.
Yeah.
It's
but it's definitely not Matthew's fault.
Do you know that? Well,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's Matthew's fault for
100%.
talking to us,
Sharing such
for
great
taking a shot on an upstart group of kids like us.
For being so generous with his
do it.
time.
He'll
and-
never
and
do it
talking to
again.
us.
We'll never do it again.
But yeah, so maybe
wait.
we should, before we get going, just kind of hit pause and say that we
Not on the
we fucked
recording
up.
though. Not on the
We
recording.
fucked
Don't
up.
press pause on the recording.
we fucked up. We did what we hear, and what we've noticed is kind of a necessary constitutive step for a new podcast, which is recording an entire episode without recording it. We did a full interview with Matthew Flisfeder. Yeah, we did the whole thing. We talked about Žižek and film, and Matthew walked us through his book, The Symbolic, The Sublime, and Slavoj Žižek's theory of film that he wrote in 2012. And it was a fantastic conversation, and we got off. We were all feeling good, and we noticed that we didn't record it. So we're all kind of processing that trauma right now.
Yeah, and so we're gonna try again and hopefully fail better, as our boy likes to say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they say it's like the rite of passage, the bar bat mitzvah of podcasting. But I still would have liked to have not to have.
Yeah, I was feeling
experienced
a
it.
little cocky recently that it hadn't happened to us. I had remembered that was a thing and was like, oh, we haven't done that yet. Yeah, so we just want to say sorry to Matthew and thank you to Matthew for having joined us, and we hope to be able to speak with him again and actually record it next time.
Well, one thing that we did say in the episode that we'll never get back, but that I think bears being said again about Matthew's book is that it, even separate from it being a discussion about film, and of course film is what we learn from reading this book is that film is something that is intimate, like it's an intimate part of Žižek's style of intervention in theory in general. But
Definitely.
even bracketing film, like Matt's book is an incredible summary of Žižek's thought. Also, I've never really experienced such a concise explanation of Lacanian theory.
Mm-hmm.
That's
really
the sign.
fantastic.
That's the sign of true, like, I think, theoretical skill, and like a sign of a good teacher is someone who can make like the impossible, the impenetrable Lacan sensible and easy to digest. So like, what's interesting is that
he made Lacan fun for me.
Exactly. Well, and like we're often like we've asked ourselves this, and we're often asked like, what's the best introduction to Žižek's thought? And I this is like at least the introduction to Matt's book, which once again is the Symbolic, the Sublime, and Žižek's film theory. Like this is a very good introduction to what Žižek's up to.
That and also the whole world of the greater world of Marxist theory and kind of where it is at. He intertwines a lot of Frederick Jameson's type of critique into there, and similarly also a really fantastic description of that, intertwining it with
good primer. Yeah,
for sure.
So we're all So it really sucks that we lost that. However, we all felt like we wanted to nonetheless do another dive into this book and have a discussion about it. And also, I think I remember that we haven't done this one yet. Introduce ourselves. We gave it a shot recently, but maybe we'll formally kick off the episode, and I'll say, hi, I'm Peter, and I'm joined by
William. Hello.
And I am Jacob. Or Jake.
Okay. So we gave that a shot. It was a little stilted, but we can try it again next time. So maybe we can try and turn the questions we had for Matt that he answered so generously for us to ourselves, do a bit of a Stalinist self-critique and self-introspection, see if we can drum up our deep latent memories of what Matthew said to us and try and reformulate them for this episode.
Sounds good.
Well, I remember when in preparing for this episode, I actually asked the sort of the fundamental philosophical, why film?
Mm-hmm.
What's film? How does film play in here? And I think with Žižek, there's this understanding that from the outset that film, we came to Žižek, almost three of us, organically through the idea of him being a film theorist, of him being
I think that's how most people encounter him. Yeah.
I came across an article he wrote for The Guardian, and this was probably in 2013. And I went home that night, and I said to Jake that, have you heard of this guy Žižek? He's talking about Benjamin and Adorno, and you were like, oh yeah, well he's a film theorist mostly. And you told me about his movie, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. Actually, The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, which is the one that came out beforehand, which we revisited for this episode, and it is an absolutely fantastic movie. It's brilliant, and it's not just a good movie. It's a really interesting way of explicating and really exemplifying in a very obvious way what Žižek's interventions in films are doing through the films themselves. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it's 2.5 hours of like straight critique of ideology. Like it's just
uncut,
front to back, uncut, just critique to ideology rather. And it's exactly. It's like the way that the film is made is that it actually visualizes Žižek's style of intervention. Is that we have him within the thing, theorizing. And what was interesting about talking to Matt is that he actually, and we'll get to this divide, but the difference between the materialist and the idealist use of examples is that he actually described the short circuit that I think is present in The Pervert's Guide to Cinema as the idealist approach. I thought the movies were actually materialist, but anyway.
An example of not only how great the films are, but I think of the idealist approach that you were just mentioning is in Pervert's Guide to Cinema. He's talking about the Hitchcock film Psycho, and he's placed in the basement. He's talking about how the film, the kind of psychological components of the film, and then through talking about Psycho and talking about the functioning of the ego and the id and the superego and all that, he starts talking about the Francis Ford Coppola film The Conversation, which, if anyone hasn't seen, is a truly incredible film. But he moves to that film and then draws a connection between the bathroom scene in The Conversation and the bathroom scene in Psycho. So it's not like we're entering Psycho to kind of truly understand. I think Norman Bateman is the killer in that movie. We're not trying to understand his motivations, but we're understanding how the filmic psychoanalytical example that he's using isn't movie specific, but is expressed in movies. So the idea that he's expressing is manifested concretely through the films, but is not merely reducible to those films.
Right. Where Žižek is using the films to explain ideas, in psychoanalysis, and I think with film foremost it's psychoanalysis, that he's sort of short-circuiting these films to explain various theories, but he's not his film theory doesn't advance necessarily the form of film theory. He doesn't talk about the form of film theory, but it's very content based. It's very specific to the actual movies, to the directors, to what we're seeing in the actual image itself of the film, as opposed to advancing a theory on like like I said, the form of film. It's content first. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
But it's also,
It's
I
an
don't know
interesting
actually, because I
switch,
think
though.
it's. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it is, but that's somewhat in distinction to what I just said. But I don't think that they're necessarily contradictory. It's just that it is like filmmaker specific. Obviously, he's really into Hitchcock and David Lynch, but it's insofar as those filmmakers, not even in a knowing way on their own part, but express psychoanalytical concepts. So like it is that switch, and I think that exact switch from the like focus on the example to the filmmaker to the greater concept is very much that short circuit that we've generally been in dialogue with in relation to Žižek's work.
Well, I think maybe we can get more into that distinction a bit later on, but just going back to the opening question, Jake, why film? And I think we were passing by the answer there a little bit, or we were getting the contours of it. But I think he presents his or what I take to be one of his arguments for film or for analyzing film with theory, or perhaps the other way around, at the near the beginning of Pervert's Guide to Cinema, and he's talking about the Matrix. The famous scene where Morpheus is presenting Neo with the two pills, the red pill and the blue pill, and the one represents illusions, the Matrix, and the one represents reality. And Žižek says, I want a third pill. And he says, the reality in illusion itself. And I think that phrase, the reality in illusion itself, which he expands upon by describing as the need to fiction reality, I think that is cinema.
Oh, yeah, that is cinema.
Yeah.
It's
So
the most brilliant articulation of it I've heard. It's just so interesting.
Yeah, and he goes on and he says, we humans are not naturally born into reality. We are integrated into a symbolic space. And for Žižek, cinema is, I mean, it's a bit different now, arguably, with video games and with TV especially, but particularly with the 20th century, I mean, what is a more central medium than film for integrating us into a symbolic space collectively?
Yeah. And what Matthew adds, or rather teases out with Žižek, is that it, like, fundamentally his engagement with film is about the critique of ideology, and film is such a great manifestation of that approach, because it simultaneously is like ideology par excellence, if you look at, say, the Marvel movies, for instance, but it's also perfectly utilized to express a critique of ideology as well.
Right, and this is a distinction also that at the beginning of the first chapter of Matthew's book, he's talking about the history of film criticism, and even more specifically about Lacanian film criticism, and how in the 60s and 70s and 80s it was very much focused on a kind of critique of ideology, wherein the ideology is expressed through the film as an example of
the feminist critique, for instance.
There's
exactly
it's historiography versus historicism, right? So like historical examples of the predominant ideology are critiqued versus a critique of ideology as such, right? Which is what which is what I think you were going for. I think what lurks behind Žižek's formula there is, I think, the Lacanian, that reality is structured like a fiction. And I think that what cinema does is that we have a very, like, the Lacanian trifecta of symbolic, imaginary, and the real. I think that cinema actually hinges as a between the symbolic order and the real. We have cinema, which is the imaginary, and I think that lurks behind this sort of. Can you go over it again? That what Žižek says at the beginning of the film that's so brilliant.
The choice between illusions and reality, and the third pill is reality in illusions itself, or in illusion itself.
Exactly, and I think
it's very much it's very much in accordance with what we've been discussing more generally with Žižek in terms of, like, especially what we explored in the sublime objective ideology, but like there's no non-symbolic approach to the world, right? Like we don't have this way of stepping outside of our symbolic universe and like seeing like reality as it is. But what's so interesting in the way that film is expressed is like film doesn't have to be like factually true in order to express like, key emotional or, political truths about the world and about yourself. Like no one, if you're truly experiencing the kind of art of film, you're not going to realize like, hey, wait a minute, that was made up. That wasn't, I don't believe that anymore. It's like, it's the true like effects of film that it can have on you is impacting that symbolic world that you inhabit.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the word true because, or truth, because it feels like the traditional critique of ideology is one in which if we can strip back fiction and illusion enough, we will be exposed to the capital T truth, right? To what's really going on, which I think is the dichotomy between the red and the blue pill. And this third pill is actually understanding, why truth is always structured as a fiction originally, right? Is that third pill is that the notion of stripping back illusion to get to truth is to only understand that the truth that we get to is always already structured as another illusion, as a more original illusion. And this is so film on some level allows us to engage with the real or the quilting point behind any truth claim that operates within any ideological system, right? And film is this. So why film? I mean, why not film? But really, I remember thinking when we wanted to prepare for this episode, I was like, oh right, maybe we should ask even why Žižek has such I think he privileges film, right? I think anyone who reads his books learns that film is a privileged medium, and I think Peter, you're right in saying that it's privileged in its access to ideology as such. It allows us to critique ideology as such, because it is the reality in illusion, right?
Yeah. The third pill is dialectical materialism, folks. But we can save that for the end.
It's a jagged pill too, as well.
That's what Alanis Morissette was also talking about.
Yeah, I'm fucking Skippy. Yeah.
Which I actually revisited that.
Hand in my pocket, and the other one is watching.
I never listened to that album before, and I checked it out recently. Man, it fucking slams. It slaps. It bangs. It's great. It's a good album.
What do you mean that Alanis Morissette is talking about dialectical materialism?
Her album is called Jagged Little Pill, which is what.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if swallowing a jagged pill is actually like a phrase or an expression, but I get it purely from Alanis. So shout out to her.
It's like
okay. What were we talking about in terms of dialectical material?
I think we're now onto the discussion as to like the relationship between film and ideology, because that's
right. And I just want to actually, if I can just jump on that for a second, I think that the idea that films function ideologically is not a new concept to anyone. And to me, like a great example of that is like, the very typical kinds of critiques you might see in the media these days about films as being, the Joker is an incel movie, or this movie is misogynistic, or one of my more favorite examples is the involvement of the actual CIA in the production of many American films. Films or TV shows like Jack Ryan and the many CIA films that came out when we were younger are very obviously functions of the ideological hegemony of the CIA in the United States that are quite literally bankrolled by them and by the military. But this is not the type of ideology that Žižek is talking about in films.
Yeah, I mean, there's the classic example from They Live. I'm sure everyone, that might have been, most people's first encounter with Žižek talking about ideology, where, the scene where the two men, John Nada is fighting with his construction worker friend about putting on the critique of ideology glasses, and then John Nada says like, either put these on or you're going to eat from that trash can. And then like suddenly Žižek pops up. He's like, we're all eating from the trash can all the time, trash can of ideology. And in terms of the approach to ideology that film gives us, It's like yeah, it's not merely that films are ideological, and it's not that films necessarily are intentionally so, right? Like the whole thing with Žižek and directors, it's not like Hitchcock was a Lacanian Marxist psychoanalysis, critique of ideology guy, but rather we can like take something out of Hitchcock, which is nonetheless already there, but there's something expressed that isn't about intent, because the critique is not trying to read motivation or subtle tendencies in certain directors or films,
Yeah. There's a quote from, so what I discern to be Matt's thesis in this book, which might be arguable, but right at the beginning he says, film theory must focus on theorizing ideology by way of film criticism. And then to quote the book directly, he says, Žižek's relevance to film studies comes by way of his rethinking of the project of theory and the role of film studies within this project. And I think what we ideally will get to by the end of this conversation is what is emphasized by Matt at the end of the book, is the emphasis on theory.
The best expression of that I came across was his chapter called Class Struggle in Film Studies. And he's talking about the dynamic between theory as it's expressed in like 70s, 80s Lacanian type approach, and post theory, which is can be seen as a kind of outcrop of the post-structural, postmodern approach to film. And he expresses the dynamic between theory as it arises via the Marxist critique and post theory through the postmodern critique, and says that this interaction is class struggle, and that the type of analysis of film is an expression of that, and that we can understand the dynamic here to be manifestations in the same way that we've talked about in terms of political manifestations of the rift in terms of the dynamic of class struggle. So he has a quote from Louis Althusser here. At the beginning of the chapter, it says, "The class struggle has not only an economic form and a political form, but also a theoretical form. Or if you prefer, the same class struggle exists and must therefore be fought out by the proletariat in the economic field, in the political field, and in the theoretical field. When it is fought out in the theoretical field, the concentrated class struggle is called philosophy. Philosophy is, in the last instance, class struggle in the field of theory," which I think is a fantastic description of broadly what Žižek is doing in terms of our discussions generally about theory, and what are you doing when you're reading and thinking about and writing and interacting with theory? Is it political? Is it merely a distraction, or is there somehow kind of concrete or political concern going on there?
Right. Well, he goes on to say that, this is quoting Matt, that theory is precisely that which makes possible symbolic intervention into the realm of the real. As Fabio Viggi points out, a political act, which I guess is somewhat in line with what you were just saying, although I think that the role of psychoanalysis would inflect quite differently what Žižek is doing with critiquing film than what Althusser might do if he did.
Well, that's true, but I will counter with a quote. This is Matteo. I should point out, though, that the terms of the debate between theory and post-theory center on psychoanalysis and film studies rather than the Marxian critique of ideology. As in the question of psychoanalysis is the kind of crucial crux of the class dynamic here between theory and post-theory. However, Matthew continues here, I interpret the focus on psychoanalysis as one that speaks more generally to the critique of ideology. As I argue further down, psychoanalysis operates within the Marxian critique of ideology, especially for Žižek, as a version of dialectical materialism appropriate to the era of postmodernity. So, the question of psychoanalysis here is the Marxian critique of ideology for Žižek. Not that we can reduce Žižek's approach as the Marxist approach, But psychoanalysis is being used for Žižek not only as a method of the critique of ideology, but also for Matthew here, the kind of crucial concern of class struggle in film theory.
Interesting.
Which I think is extremely interesting.
Yeah.
But there's also this role of desire in film, right? Because one of other Žižek's refrains about film is that film teaches us how to desire. So I wonder how that fits into the ideology critique. What do you think?
Well, like in capitalism, I mean, the whole crucial approach to the critique of ideology is questioning how we desire and what we desire, right? Like our desires aren't natural to us; they're given to us through capitalism, right? Like ideology teaches us how to desire, right? And like that's so crucial in say the approach to film here, where explicitly or not, we're often, it's easy to imagine like how our desires are expressed or like given to us. We are interpolated by film in terms of desire, and the whole counteraction of psychoanalysis and the critique of ideology is to navigate and counter how our desire is given to us and how we can not get rid of desire, because you can never get rid of it, but how you can start to desire different things.
Well, there's a relationship between the organization of desire and the symbolic realm, right? Is that we are always already existing in the symbolic realm. We're initiated into the symbolic realm, which is essentially the structural organization of desire, which on some level can be understood as always already ideological, right? And so that there's a relationship between the symbolic order, ideology, and enjoyment that film, with its I think the potential for film to instantiate events, the real, which kind of, I think the film can be positioned between the symbolic and the real in this way that allows for us to see how enjoyment is structured in the symbolic, right? It's not simply just about critiquing the functions of the symbolic realm. It's about understanding how the symbolic realm,
it's the symbolic network around the kind of real kernel of desire.
Exactly. Yeah. Well,
Function.
so film for Matt and so film for Žižek can function as a sublime object of ideology, as a parallax object, as an object that shows us on some level how the symbolic order is organized, right, and around what it is organized. And so,
can you explain how it might be a parallax object? Because that's one of Matt's points, right?
Parallax should be in contrast to subjective relativism insofar as what it shows you is that the gaze of the subject is always already inscribed in the object, right? So it's not just about subjective relativism insofar as perspective is changed. It's that the object is always already imbued with the desire or the gaze of the viewer, right?
Exactly.
In terms of the description of parallax view or object, I want to shout out Matthew here for using a fantastic example in his book. And it was in reference to, so unfortunately, I forget the person's name, but it's an example in which you point your arm up above you and you open one eye, and then you close that eye and open the other, and the perspective of your arm shifts, but it's not like your arm as separately from you switched, but rather that through your change in perspective, the object itself is also shifted. And like philosophically, that's how Žižek thinks about engaging with like putting two views together, putting two kind of like theoretical approaches together and having them like interact with one another as a kind of parallax shift in how you relate with that theory. But also, it's also a psychoanalytical claim about subjectivity as well.
Well, that's exactly so because the way Matt describes it is that the parallax object instantiates a coincidence between idealism and materialism, which is like Hegel's subject and substance, is that we have a coincidence between the subject and the object, and film as a parallax object shows us, much like your example of the finger when we close one eye and open the other, is that we see that the object is always already imbued with the desire of the gaze, right? And so if we approach film in that matter, we see like what the film actually shows us, if we're looking at it awry, so to speak, is that our desire is always already wrapped up in it. And so if we understand film from the perspective of a critique of ideology, we can feel or see or experience how film organizes our enjoyment. But that will either be in line with a particular ideology, or like a constituted ideology, or from Žižek and Matt's perspective, we're going to understand how ideology is constitutive of that desire, right? So we can see when we watch an Avengers film, like how our desire is like explicitly organized, right? Like any like sort of like obviously ideological film, you can almost like, unless you have nothing in between your two ears, like you can feel how enjoyment is organized.
It's funny with those movies because they're so like overly, they're meant to be so enjoyable, and yet they're absolutely unenjoyable to watch.
Totally,
they're loaded. They're so focus groups. Because they're trying to include like everyone's enjoyment at once.
But a proper parallax object is equated to the objet petit, which is a suspension of desire, right? Is to keep desire,
delayed.
And it can never ultimately be fulfilled. Like the desire isn't to be like, there's no ultimate end to your desire. And I think playing off that approach in terms of considering the symbolic order is like, there's no absent approach, either absent symbolic order or desire that we can somehow step beyond. And I think we made that point in a way already, but like the whole crucial thing here is the ordering of that desire, rather than whether or not desire can be like fulfilled or denied or done away with.
Right. And wasn't he trying to make that point to us before? Do you remember that, Matthew? What film was he talking about?
We talked about.
Oh, it was Casablanca, wasn't it?
I think so.
Oh yeah,
that could be it. Yeah.
It was Casablanca because at the end of Casablanca, she leaves.
Yeah.
And the thing that is disruptive about that film, and the thing that makes it so great, is that it doesn't sort of inaugurate the classic or repeat the classic production of a couple at the end of a film, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon for the rest of your life.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
I was thinking of maybe just trying to explain the lighthouse and Annihilation again as the difference between like the film trying to show you the end point of desire, and the lighthouse film which doesn't deliver it.
That's a great example. You should sound off on that.
Well, briefly, without trying to describe the plots of two films in case people haven't seen them, but I think that a good filmic examples of this are two films that came out pretty close to each other. One's called Annihilation, and the other is Annihilation with Natalie Portman, and the other is The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. And without going too far into it, Annihilation is about some unknown force which is kind of colonizing this territory that the military is sending in these explorers into, they're trying to figure out the source of this issue, or the source of this infection in this area. And Natalie Portman's character, after going through trials and tribulations, losing all the rest of her cohort, arrives at the end of the film at a lighthouse, and finds the end, specifically what is causing the sort of hallucinogenic infection of this whole territory. And what she sees is basically a man in a morph suit. And he kind of dances around for, I shit you not, like 11 minutes and you've got the kind of like wow, wow, and there was something so deeply disappointing about it, because
the sound of your satisfied desire.
Exactly, and it was so unsatisfying. Whereas with The Lighthouse, which if anyone hasn't seen from 2019, is such a good movie. You've got Robert Pattinson being taken to a mysterious island at the beginning, which maybe in Žižek terms you could read as being sort of taken into a symbolic space, and he discovers throughout the course of the film that William Dafoe's character, a man who's been tending to this lighthouse for, we're unsure how long, it could be days or weeks or years or decades, and he has some kind of sexual relationship with something in the lighthouse or in the light or at the top of the lighthouse. It's unclear. But we see at various points in the film some kind of communion or sexual union with whatever is up there. And Robert Pattinson eventually tries to figure out what's up there, and he takes various turns to attempt to get to the top of the lighthouse, and he can't get up there until finally he does, and it's the final scene in the movie. And he's gazing upon whatever it is at the center of the film of the lighthouse, and we don't see it. But it's it's a powerful moment, and it's, I think, deeply psychoanalytic too, that he has this confrontation with it, and it's a horrible confrontation. He's screaming, and we can only see his face, but we can't see the object of his desire. So it's like being met for him with the object of his desire, much like we were met with the object of our desire watching Annihilation. It's a confrontation with something, but for us, the viewer, it's delayed or it's absent, right? And I think it's much more exactly. It's much more instructive in The Lighthouse than it is in Annihilation. I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys, but I thought it might be a way of going through the difference there with desire.
No.
I think that was great.
Well, and that relates to The Wrong Man, right, Pete? The beginning of The Wrong Man.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, we had a discussion with Matthew as well in terms of the Hitchcock film The Wrong Man, which he writes about in his book. And for Matthew and Žižek, their reading of The Wrong Man, which is actually made in very close proximity to like peak Hitchcock, like Vertigo, Birds, all that stuff. Where Hitchcock is usually like he makes cameos in his films, like he's getting on the bus in Vertigo. It's like Where's Waldo, like very, very brief encounters. But at the beginning of The Wrong Man, he's doing like this kind of like sitting on a chair, speaking directly into the camera, describing like what is going to happen in the film and how the audience should relate with it. Like he's being explicit, and for Matthew and Žižek, it totally fails in actually fulfilling the kind of classic Hitchcockian maneuver that it's just like firing on all cylinders when it comes to like Psycho or Vertigo or The Birds, all that. But it's like the exception, the failure of Hitchcock that expresses what is actually so brilliant in him. But there's actually something very Hegelian about that in terms of like Hitchcock's failure to function or actually approach film as he normally would actually relates the kind of like truth that's evident in his filmic approach.
Right.
Which is what? I mean, Matthew talked about the MacGuffin. Do you guys remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The whole core of Hitchcock's approach is the mistaken identity, the mistaken interpolated character, like it is in North by Northwest, where Thornhill. Yeah.
It's both.
Thornhill is mistaken for Kaplan, but it's just because he raised his hand in a completely different context, but he becomes Kaplan, who's not even a real person. He's kind of simultaneously himself and not himself, but he's also Kaplan. And then there's this whole that's a really core Hitchcock approach, the mistaken identity. And what happens, what's wrong with The Wrong Man is that there's no mistake. He actually tells you what's going on, right?
Because the parallax object and the objet petit ties into this, like, understanding film as a parallax object, or some films, right? Because I think we need to emphasize the fact that Žižek privileges examples of film, of various films, and repeats those examples, right? Which is the materialist turn here, is that the materialist repeats examples because what they prove is that there's a universal that would be that applies to any symbolic order, right? And that why these examples are repeated is because they, on some level, exemplify something like a pure parallax object, or the objet petit, which is, to go back to the discussion of the wrong man and the Hitchcockian MacGuffin.
Yeah, exactly.
Which the MacGuffin is, what is it? The anecdote is that there's two men on a train, and one man asks the other about his suitcase or like the package that he has, and he asks, what is that? And the man says it's a MacGuffin, and the first man says, well, what's a MacGuffin? And the man with the package says it's something, what is it? It's a tool for hunting. It's used for hunting lions in the Scottish Highlands, and the first man says, well, there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands, and the man says, well, now you know exactly how effective a MacGuffin is. And we have a quote here from Matt that says the MacGuffin is a nothing that confers on the coordinates of the symbolic reality an efficient intersubjective relation. So it's a pure void that functions as the object cause of desire, or as the object petit. It's a cause which in itself, it does not exist. It's not an actual object, but it is present only in its effects. And so it organizes, essentially the symbolic order, or the fantasies that sustain reality. And so,
like Kaplan,
like the Kaplan, exactly, right? So we see a certain kind of void functioning in such a way that it buoys up all that, the events or the effects, but it itself is non-existent. And so going back to the discussion of like, well, why film, and why the films that Žižek constantly relies on as a way to like short circuit explain various theoretical concepts, why certain films, why certain directors, is because we see that there's a particular way in which film can operate like an objet petit, that it can operate as a singular or universal singular, right? A sort of a singular entity that persists as universal regardless of the multitude of interpretations, the sort of the overdetermination that is like I think specific to a sublime object is that we have an object that there's something excessive about it regardless of all the ways in which we can view it. And so there's, once again, to draw the contrast between films that are an example of how a particular ideology organizes our enjoyment, and then films that show us how enjoyment is organized.
Exactly.
That's
like in The Lighthouse, like I was trying to explain, is like the lighthouse is this totally overdetermined object, and it functions exactly as a MacGuffin as well. It's in the sense of the object cause of desire, but we never actually access it. Right?
Yeah, it's overdetermined by a multiplicity of like symbolic meanings, and through that, like that is the symbolic, or the surplus enjoyment of the object itself. Right.
There's something always excessive about these examples, right? That they exceed all the multitude of interpretations. And I think that this is why we get why we're teasing out here a relationship between film, at least the film that Žižek liked to talk about, and jouissance. And so, like, I think in order to get, like, what's the next step for us in this conversation is, I think back to the original question, why film, is that there's a potential in film to direct us to encounter this relationship between the object and subject, between the realities that structure, the fantasies that structure our reality, and how we are always already involved in them.
There's I think a good example of that And I think we wanted to get into this with Matthew, but we didn't have a chance. But certainly we discussed it in the Sublime Object of Ideology. Žižek's discourse on the Titanic, right? The Titanic as a sublime object, but also the kind of symbolic universe of the Titanic was opened up before like the actual Titanic sank, via like just pop in the popular imagination, like the horizon of an event like that was opened up, for example, in a story that was written, shortly before the Titanic actually sank, of a large ship called the Titan, pretty much the same size, hits an iceberg and goes down off the coast of, on the Atlantic. And I think similarly, a kind of filmic example of that is like all the profusion of pre 9/11 films about terrorism and airplanes and large buildings coming down, and like that symbolic universe was like already open in order for 9/11 to happen, so that 9/11 itself is almost kind of like a cinematic event. Mm-hmm. And that I think there's a real exchange there between the enjoyment or the kind of symbolic universe that we in the 90s everyone was kind of like enjoying in film, and then the actual event, historical event happens, and your reaction is that it looked like a film.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say about Hitchcock's introduction to The Wrong Man is that he actually elides the potential for a critique of ideology by saying, this movie is based on real events. We all think about and there's a paradigm there, right? Like every Law and Order, the CSI, like it's like these, we're supposed to, what the director is telling us that the fiction that we're about to witness is essentially just a staging of reality, and it's like
I think
that he lies.
I think this is why film and art sucks so much right now. It's like it with the recourse to so-called true events. It's like it completely forecloses the symbolic efficacy of those pieces of art.
Exactly, the symbolic. So, I think that what happens with film and with cinema is that it's all about symbolic efficacy. It's all about the, why I think Matt says at the end of the book, there's something cinematic about Žižek's theory. Right.
And Žižek himself.
And Žižek as image, which we get through Sophie Fiennes' films, Pervert's Guides, right? Is that there in cinema is a potential for, it's not saying that the fantasies that structure our reality, it's red pill, blue pill, man. It's the motherfucking third pill. It's not that our realities can be stripped, like the illusions and the fantasies of our realities can be stripped back to present a truth, which is what I feel like that announcement of Hitchcock at the beginning of the film is like, what you're seeing is in fact influenced by truth. You can see the truth. I'm showing you that it's there.
You can't expect to see this in the film yet.
Exactly. Yeah. But what is cinematic par excellence is to leave everything suspended, is to show not the fantasy that structures, not the particular fantasy that structures our reality, but that reality is in and of itself
structured.
It's that jagged little dialectical pill that we were talking about. The pre 9/11 symbolic universe combining terrifyingly with reality. Let's say the real that we kind of culturally and symbolically experienced on 9/11. It's like this collision of the symbolic and the real, embedded in the two towers coming down.
But Jake, I feel like this is a great time to hit us with that last bit. That you were kind of angling towards it with describing Žižek's theory as filmic almost. But I want to
as cinematic. Well, what we noticed in what we felt when we were watching The Pervert's Guide to Cinema was how much fun it is, and I think the attempt on Matt's part here at the end of the book is to say that enjoyment is not just a byproduct or a kind of a happenstance of Žižek's intervention. It is Žižek's intervention, right? It's
Right.
it's part and parcel of what he's doing. And to quote Matt here, it is precisely because Žižek does theory in the language of the cinema that his approach makes possible the conditions for the interpolation of political subjects out of the everyday. Sophie Fiennes is quite correct when she claims that Žižek makes theory cinematic. As seductive as his approach to theory may be, it is the enjoyment felt in his approach that makes him such an appealing figure in critical theory. We are drawn in by Žižek initially, not because of his take on Lacan or Hegel, but because he takes elements of the everyday life world of popular culture and turns them on their head. Now, the last part of this book is really, 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 really fucking good. But I hate to do a long quote, but I think it deserves it. Matt goes on to say, theory makes enjoyment the very raison d'etre of radical change. We are ethical subjects not because of some objective neutral sense of what we ought to do, but because of our attachment to an impossible jouissance for which we cannot do anything but act. This, then, has to do with a subjective realism that bears on one's own objective position within the existing relations of production. And sticking to the analytical position of drive allows one to subjectivize the truth of one's objective conditions of existence. It should be no question, then, as to why the evacuation of theory from film studies is one of the most ideological attempts to rid the discipline of the political. Man, hot fire. Fucking
It's a great ending to a book right there. Yeah.
hot fire. I don't know why I can't even remember why I was so goddamn excited about the ending of that book, but
Well, I think crucial to what you're saying there is the, I mean, as we've been discussing, the kind of role of enjoyment, not only as like the way in which the critique of ideology engages with enjoyment, but also that like Žižek's approach is enjoyable, right? Like it's I think it's no mistake that we all came to Žižek through his film analysis, because it's so enjoyable, because it creates that kind of point at which we as the subjective viewer can at least have the potential for that kind of intersection of, what is he saying, our everyday life world and politics, right?
right.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Enjoyment. Why film and enjoyment and theory and enjoyment and ideology. It's like something about Žižek's approach to film is supposed to bring us to how enjoyment is central to what is ideological. I don't really
And
want
also
the
maybe
podcast,
even
but-
central to the critique of ideology. I don't know. Is
No,
that possible?
I think that's definitely true, because I mean, as like theory, I mean, like he's making theory fun, right? Like it's enjoyable. Like the actual experience of not only viewing him, but like approaching these ideas via theory is a kind of twisting of enjoyment, freeing it from its ideological like sway or being merely a function of ideology, in that we are taught how to enjoy through it, but that like through the kind of maneuver of this enjoyable approach, we can actually come to form a kind of political counter to ideology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is making me feel like at some point, sooner or later, we should talk about the role of enjoyment in politics, because I know that Todd has talked a lot about that, and of course Žižek does as well. So maybe that's something to tackle in the near future. But I think this is a good place to end. What do you guys think?
I think so. And once again, I want to thank Matthew for having joined us and for supplying this fantastic book for us. I know that his views, he understands his views have kind of evolved from this, but I think this is not only a great film theory book, a great Žižek book, but like a fantastic encounter and introduction to Žižek's philosophy. And we want to thank our patrons and thank all of our listeners. You can check us out on Patreon, on YouTube, Twitter. I just started us a Facebook group today. So
Holy moly.
0 viewers on that, but I think we've got to get more comfortable with plugging ourselves here. So thanks for everyone listening. I'm Peter, that's Jake, that's Will, and we're Žižek and so on. See you later.